At the end of World War II, the world was horrified to discover the magnitude of the crime perpetrated by the Nazi regime. The systematic murder of millions of people, mostly Jews, carried out with a bureaucratic coldness that defied human comprehension. However, what was known for decades as the Holocaust was not just a process of extermination. It was also, in its final stages, a meticulous effort to hide the evidence of that crime. Operation 1005, also known as Sonderaktion 1005, was a secret mission of the Third Reich intended to erase the physical traces of the genocide. Between 1942 and 1944, as the war began to turn against Germany, the Nazi High Command ordered the exhumation and burning of millions of corpses, the destruction of gas chambers, crematoria, and documents, and the murder of witnesses. This plan, sinister in its conception and execution, represented the final stage of a death machine that sought not only to exterminate its victims, but also to eliminate all traces of their existence. Operation 1005, the sinister Nazi operation to destroy evidence of the Holocaust. By mid-1942, the Nazi regime had already made significant progress in implementing the so-called final solution, the systematic plan for the extermination of European Jewry. Millions had already been murdered in extermination camps such as Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, as well as in mass shootings perpetrated by the Einsatzgruppen in the east. The machinery of death operated with industrial precision, and the regime's confidence in victory was such that those responsible barely concerned themselves with the evidence they were leaving behind. But that attitude would change drastically. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union. During the first months, progress was significant, and with it came a brutal extermination campaign against Soviet Jewry. But by late 1942, with the stalemate on the Eastern Front and the progressive collapse of the German lines, the leadership of the Third Reich began to fear the consequences of its crimes if the war did not end in a swift victory. The possibility of defeat no longer seemed impossible. It was in this context of growing concern for preserving the secrecy of the Holocaust that Operation 1005 was conceived and launched. The person directly responsible for this mission was Paul Blobel, an SS officer who had commanded mass executions in Ukraine, such as those at Babi Yar, where more than 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. Blobel was perfectly familiar with the methods of extermination and the logistics of mass murder, and was therefore chosen by Heinrich Himmler to lead a special operation whose task would be nothing less than to make the bodies of the victims of the Holocaust disappear. The initial order to begin the operation was issued in the summer of 1942. The objective was twofold: to prevent the Reich's enemies from finding incriminating evidence if they were to occupy the territories where the massacres had taken place, and to allow the official Nazi propaganda narrative to deny, minimize, or reinterpret the events. The reports, letters, and transport logs that spoke of alleged evacuations to the east and hypothetical forced labor camps had already been carefully crafted with coded language to avoid direct references to extermination. Now it was time to eliminate the bodies and all physical evidence as well. The codename 1005 reveals nothing at first glance, like so many other Nazi bureaucratic codes. It made no direct reference to extermination or cover-up. It was designed to maintain the secrecy of the operation, even in internal documents. Blobel, as commander, had special squads made up primarily of Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners forced to perform tasks related to the disposal of corpses. These groups were sent to former execution sites in the east, such as abandoned extermination camps, mass graves, ravines, and forests, with the goal of digging up bodies, piling them up, burning them, and crushing their bones, eliminating all traces of the crime. The procedure was not uniform everywhere. At some points, iron grates were improvised from railroad tracks on which the corpses were placed to be incinerated with gasoline or firewood. In others, additional graves were simply dug, where the remains were burned and the ashes scattered or reburied. Reports from the few survivors and local witnesses described the unbearable stench, the incessant fires, and the forced labor to which the prisoners were subjected, knowing they would be killed once their work was completed. Operation 1005 began in locations relatively remote from the Western Front and in areas firmly under German control. The first rehearsals were held at the Chelmno extermination camp in occupied Poland, where at least 150,000 people had been murdered. It was later extended to Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, camps that had already served their purpose and were either closed or about to be closed. One by one, the sites of horror were cleaned, their structures destroyed, their foundations removed, and their grounds camouflaged as simple agricultural land or virgin forests. The same happened with the large execution sites in Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Latvia, where thousands of mass graves were emptied and burned. Operation 1005 also served as a desperate attempt to reorganize the historical narrative from its origins, depriving Germany's enemies of the tools to accuse the regime of genocide. It wasn't enough to murder millions. It was also necessary to erase the traces, the documents, the ruins, the graves, the bodies, and, of course, the witnesses. This last aspect explains why so many Sonderkommandos were executed barely after completing their duties and why official documents of the operation were scarce, cryptic, and fragmentary. The clandestine nature of the operation did not prevent, however, some reports from reaching Allied intelligence, especially through the Polish resistance, the government in exile, or British interceptions of encrypted messages. But the scale of the crime still eluded the imagination of many, and concrete evidence remained scarce. It wasn't until the liberation of the camps in 1944 and 1945, and the subsequent collection of testimonies and evidence, that the world would begin to grasp not only the genocide committed, but also the systematic attempt to erase it from the face of the earth. The Walking Dead, the gruesome mass burning of corpses in the camps, and the Sonderkommandos. The gruesome task of eliminating the traces of the extermination fell upon the shoulders of a group of prisoners who lived and died at the limits of the imaginable. The Sonderkommandos were prisoners, mostly Jews, forcibly selected to assist in the logistics of the mass murders. Their role was to operate the gas chambers, remove the corpses, extract their gold teeth, cut their hair, and then burn them in crematoria. With the arrival of Operation 1005, their duties expanded, as they had to exhume and burn bodies that had been buried in mass graves for months, even years. The process began in places like Chelmno, Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec, camps where mass murders no longer took place because they had been dismantled, but where tens of thousands of bodies remained buried in open trenches or makeshift graves. In these places, the stench of decomposition was unbearable and sanitary conditions were zero. The Sonderkommandos had to work by hand with shovels, iron hooks, ropes and makeshift carts to remove the decomposed bodies, which were then piled up and prepared for incineration. Burning was not carried out in industrial furnaces. Instead, more rudimentary but still highly effective methods were devised. One of the most common consisted of building large metal structures from railroad tracks placed on stones or bricks, which functioned as giant grills. The corpses were placed in alternating layers with firewood and soaked with gasoline or oil to facilitate combustion. The bonfires could burn for days, constantly fed with new bodies. At camps like Treblinka, where an estimated 700,000 to 900,000 people were murdered, the smoke from these funeral pyres would fill the sky for weeks. The Sonderkommandos were not volunteers, but Jews who saw their friends and family members die every day, so they knew their fate was sealed from the start. The SS used them as disposable tools. After a few months of work, they were executed and replaced by new prisoners in a cycle of death carefully designed to prevent any surviving witnesses. Even so, some managed to leave written records of their experience, hiding diaries and letters that would be found after the war. One such testimony is that of the Sonderkommando. Zalman Gradowski, a prisoner at Auschwitz-Birkenau, secretly wrote his memoirs on scraps of paper and buried them near the crematorium ruins. In one of his texts he recounted, "We, the living dead, are witnesses. Our eyes have seen what no man must ever see. Our arms have thrown the bodies of our brothers, our mothers, our children into the fire." At Auschwitz, where Operation 1005 was also implemented, the scale of the crime was even greater. Instead of exhuming bodies, they focused on accelerating the burning of the most recently burned corpses, as the gas chambers operated until almost the end of the war. The crematoria, designed by the Topf and Sons Company, operated day and night, unable to keep up with the pace of mass murder. Therefore, Bodies were often incinerated outdoors in large open-air burning pits. The efficiency of mass burning became an objective in itself. Internal reports analyzed factors such as body type, thin or heavyset, age, the humidity of the remains, and optimal fuel use. The fattier corpses of women and children were placed beneath the thinner ones to fan the flames. The human body, transformed into a unit of energy, became a variable in the extermination equation. Sonderkommandos' participation was not passive. They truly proved to be the vertical backbone of the macabre operation. Although they lived under terror, some plotted rebellions. At Sobibor, an uprising in October 1943 led to the escape of some 300 prisoners, although many were captured. At Auschwitz-Birkenau on October 7, 1944, the Sonderkommandos of Crematorium 4 rebelled, murdering several SS men and blowing up part of the facility. The repression was brutal and all were executed, but their actions remained as a symbol of resistance amidst absolute horror. As the Allies advanced in the east, Operation 1005 became more hasty. In many cases, the Nazis failed to finish burning all the corpses. In places like Majdanek or the Rumbula forest, the Soviets found partially emptied graves, charred bones, ashes, and personal belongings of the victims. This evidence would prove crucial in subsequent legal proceedings. The mass burnings left not only physical scars, but also psychological ones. The few Sonderkommandos who survived, such as Philipp Müller, who testified at the Frankfurt trials, described in detail the smells, the heat, the screams, and the deathly silence that remained after each day. Many of them stated that their greatest fear was not death, but dying without having recounted what they had seen. The mass burning of corpses carried out during Operation 1005 represented the ultimate act of contempt for human life, carried out with absolute cynicism. The Nazis not only murdered millions, but also sought to annihilate their physical memory, to erase their remains, their faces, their names, to ensure that nothing would remain, to ensure that no one could prove what had happened. But ironically, it was in this very attempt at a cover-up that they left indelible marks. The disturbed graves, the ashes, the crushed bones, the buried testimonies, and the silenced but alive survivors. The first evacuation, emptying and transfer of concentration camps to extermination camps or forced labor factories. As the Soviet army advanced from the east and the Allied forces pushed from the west, the Third Reich realized that encirclement was imminent. The vast and complex system of concentration and extermination camps was beginning to collapse under military pressure. But far from abandoning them, the Nazis opted for a strategy of restructuring and relocation that responded both to a logic of ultimate exploitation of slave labor and to the need to conceal the crimes of genocide. The camps located in occupied Poland, such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, were dismantled towards the end of 1943. These facilities, designed exclusively for mass murder, had already fulfilled their purpose under the final solution. With hundreds of thousands of victims buried on their grounds, they became critical sites to be cleansed by Operation 1005. After the corpses were burned and the structures destroyed, the grounds were planted with trees or converted into farms. German settlers were even brought in to simulate a semblance of normality. In these cases, there were no prisoner transfers because almost all had been previously murdered. But in other still active camps, such as Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, Stutthof or Gross Rosen, the situation was different. Tens of thousands of prisoners remained there, including Jews, Poles, Soviets, Roma, and other minorities. With the enemy at the gates, the SS began to gradually evacuate these camps using trains, trucks, and forced marches to move survivors into the interior of the Reich, especially to industrial facilities or factories that depended on slave labor to sustain the war effort. The transfers were not motivated by humanitarian or logistical concerns. Quite the contrary, they were part of a systematic plan of gradual liquidation and concealment. By moving prisoners, the Nazis sought to eliminate witnesses, reorganize the system of labor exploitation in safer areas, and prepare for the total destruction of the camps of origin. Each evacuation also meant a selection. The sick, weak, or deemed useless were killed on the spot or left to die. Only the physically fit were sent to other destinations, almost always to factories under the control of the SS or corporations such as IG Farben, Krupp or Siemens, which directly benefited from slave labor. At Auschwitz, the emptying began in stages in mid-1944 and intensified in January 1945. Around 60,000 prisoners were forced to march in extreme conditions, with sub-zero temperatures, without food, adequate clothing, or rest. Many were shot along the way. Those who managed to arrive alive were redistributed to camps such as Mauthausen, Bergen, Belsen, Dachau, and Buchenwald, which became final concentration points during the last months of the Reich. Majdanek camp near Lublin, the speed of the Soviet advance surprised the Nazis. There wasn't enough time to destroy all the evidence or evacuate all the prisoners. When the Red Army liberated the site in July 1944, they found thousands of shoes, mountains of human hair, documents, and intact structures, allowing the crimes to be immediately documented. It was a devastating blow to the Third Reich's narrative. From that moment on, evacuations from other camps began to accelerate. A little explored dimension of these transfers is their emotional and psychological impact on the prisoners. For many, the transfer meant a new chance at survival. For others, it was just one more step towards death. The uncertainty, exhaustion, and brutality of the SS made every move a living hell. Testimonies such as those of Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel recounts the horror of train journeys, overcrowded, without water, without air, surrounded by corpses, and the constant fear of arriving at a new, even more lethal camp. In other cases, the emptied camps were transformed into storage facilities, arsenals, or military shelters, thus concealing their former function. Some structures were demolished, others simply abandoned and camouflaged. In places like Sobibor, for example, a small farm was built on the ruins of the camp. Mass graves were leveled, trees replanted. History was literally covered over with a layer of earth. Meanwhile, deep inside Germany, the use of slave labor intensified. The regime knew the war was lost, but it continued to produce weapons, shells, aircraft parts, and munitions. In underground factories like Dora Mittelbau, where V-2 missiles were assembled, thousands of prisoners transferred from already dismantled camps were worked to death. These facilities were as lethal as the original camps, without sunlight, with endless shifts, and without hygiene or food. Life expectancy was only a few weeks. This process of mass transfer, far from being a humanitarian evacuation, was a way to prolong the genocide in new forms. It wasn't about saving the prisoners, but about continuing to squeeze their bodies and their labor force until the final collapse. The camps became a mobile, adaptable system, mutating as the Reich's strategic priorities were reconfigured. Ultimately, this process also served the central purpose of Operation 1005. By emptying the camps and redistributing the prisoners, the Nazis could begin the methodical destruction of each site. With fewer witnesses, fewer fresh bodies, less visible activity, the burning of corpses, the blowing up of gas chambers, and the eradication of entire structures became more discreet, more efficient. In that sense, the transfer was the immediate prelude to a cover-up. Thus, under the guise of a tactical reorganization, the emptying of the concentration camps was, in reality, another step in the design of a null memory, a history without victims or vestiges, where the perfect crime seemed possible. But it wasn't. The cauldron of hell. This is how the gas chambers and crematoria at the most famous camps were blown up and destroyed. In the final stages of World War II, as the Third Reich's defeats mounted and the Allied armies advanced into the heart of Europe, the Nazi regime launched one of the most cynical and calculated operations of its entire extermination machinery: the systematic destruction of the gas chambers, crematoria, and other facilities used for the mass murder of millions of people. This action was not improvised, but rather part of the overall plan of Operation 1005, whose purpose was clear: to eliminate all physical evidence of the genocide of the Jews and other groups persecuted by the regime. Since 1942, the extermination camps in occupied Poland had been operating at full speed. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Majdanek had become veritable death factories, precisely designed for serial murder. The gas chambers were at the heart of these centers. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, for example, there were 4 main crematoria known as 2, 3, 4, and 5, each with an underground gas chamber and crematory ovens designed to incinerate the bodies of thousands of victims every day. However, beginning in 1944, with the imminent collapse of the Eastern Front, The Nazi authorities began demolishing their own creations. Those directly responsible for these actions were units of the SS and Sonderkommando 1005, a branch specialized in erasing traces of the crimes of the Holocaust. Their job was to blow up structures, crush bones, scatter ashes, and camouflage the terrain until nothing remained to reveal what had happened there. At Treblinka, where between 700,000 and 900,000 people were murdered, demolitions began as early as 1943 following an internal rebellion by prisoners. The Nazis destroyed the gas chambers with explosives, dismantled barbed wire fences, ripped up railway tracks, demolished barracks, and covered the site with layers of earth. They then planted trees and built a small farm on the remains of the camp, aiming to create the illusion that the extermination camp had never existed there. Commandant Franz Stangl, later captured by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, confessed that this cover-up was a direct priority of the High Command. At Sobibor, following a similar prisoner revolt in October 1943, the camp was similarly dismantled. The gas chambers were destroyed and the area was flattened. As at Treblinka, a farm was also set up on the site. At Belzec, where approximately 500,000 people were murdered, the same method was applied, blowing up facilities, hiding mass graves, and reforesting. The case of Auschwitz-Birkenau, however, was more complex. There, the extermination operation did not completely stop until January 1945, just days before the arrival of the Red Army. The Nazis knew they would not be able to destroy everything, but they tried to minimize the impact of the Soviet discovery. On 20 January 1945, crematoria 2 and 3 were blown up by the SS, while crematoria 4 and 5 had already been set on fire, one of them following a Sonderkommando rebellion. The caches of human hair, clothing, personal belongings, and documents were also burned or removed. Despite these efforts, the Soviets found overwhelming evidence. Still smoldering crematorium ruins, barracks crammed with victims' belongings, hundreds of unburied corpses, and dying prisoners testifying. The Nazi attempt to wipe Auschwitz off the map not only failed, but it became one of the most emblematic sites of the genocide. At Majdanek, the rapidity of the Soviet advance in the summer of 1944 thwarted any attempt at concealment. There, the liberation was so sudden that the gas chambers remained intact and the warehouses were filled with objects stolen from the victims. More than 800,000 pairs of shoes, mountains of clothing, and tons of human hair were found. The Allied press, accompanied by Soviet cameramen, crudely documented what they found, and those images circulated around the world. The impact was immediate and refuted any official version that denied the existence of an organized extermination. The techniques used to demolish the death camps were meticulous. Explosives were placed in the foundations, dynamite in the concrete structures, and fire to reduce the remains to ash. When possible, bone fragments were crushed with mechanical rollers or scattered in neighboring fields. In some cases, agricultural machinery was used to flatten the ground and erase all irregularities. Mass graves were filled and covered with fresh earth. The landscape was transformed into a semblance of rural normality, with no more screams, smoke, or the smell of death, but instead trees, fields, and silence. This material cover-up was accompanied by a policy of silence within the Nazi bureaucratic apparatus. Documents related to the camps were systematically destroyed. Officials were ordered to avoid any direct reference to the extermination in their reports. Language became euphemistic. People spoke of special treatments, resettlements, evacuations, or final solutions. The machinery of denial was activated even before the genocide ended. However, the cover-up was incomplete. The ruins, however destroyed, continued to speak. Chemical traces in the remains of the gas chambers, the partially collapsed structures, the charred foundations, and the broken ovens were analyzed after the war by forensic experts. Furthermore, the testimony of survivors and some members of the Sonderkommando confirmed the use of these spaces for mass murder. At the Nuremberg trials, this evidence was crucial in reconstructing the operation of the camps. In its desperate attempt to hide the truth, the Nazi regime revealed one of its most sinister characteristics, its willingness not only to murder but to erase the crime itself, as if the victims had never existed. Fire, explosives, silence, and disturbed earth were its tools, but not even dynamite could undo the magnitude of the Shoah. The intimate crematorium, the desperate destruction of documentation, Nazi buildings, and Holocaust evidence. As the defeat of the Third Reich became inevitable, the Nazi leadership activated a final phase of deliberate concealment. The systematic destruction of all documentation, archives, written orders, accounting records, and physical structures that might reveal the magnitude of the genocide perpetrated under the euphemism of the final solution. This work, an integral part of Operation 1005, was not limited to the extermination camps. It also included ministerial offices, administrative centers, arms factories, and any state or military department that had dealt with matters related to forced labor, deportation trains, or mass murder. From early 1944, confidential orders from the High Command, including directives from Heinrich Himmler, Martin Bormann, and Hitler himself, established the urgent need to clean up the administrative traces of the genocide. For this reason, all levels of the Nazi bureaucratic apparatus were ordered to destroy files, internal correspondence, operational reports, lists of deportees, and any other document that could directly link the Reich to the crimes committed against Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners, and other victims of the regime. The methods were as varied as they were efficient. In Berlin, Krakow, Warsaw, Riga, Vienna, and other administrative cities of the Reich, coal-fired ovens were used day and night to burn tons of papers. At Auschwitz, for example, before the camp's evacuation, SS members spent days burning the files containing the identities, admissions, transfers, and deaths of hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Only a portion was saved thanks to the clandestine actions of the Sonderkommandos, who hid documents and buried them in jars or metal cans. In other cases, mechanical shredders were used, files were submerged in water tanks, scattered throughout the camp, or buried underground. Typewriters were destroyed with hammer blows, official seals were melted down, and the most critical files were transported far from the front to be incinerated. The goal was clear: to erase all written traces of the Holocaust and, with it, any possibility of future research accurately reconstructing the events. Orders also reached those responsible for rail transport. The Deutsche Reichsbahn, a key player in the deportation of millions of people to their deaths, kept detailed records on schedules, destinations, number of prisoners per car, logistical costs, and even billing per person transported. As the Reich collapsed, its officials were ordered to burn all files related to the death trains. Despite these efforts, fragments of correspondence between the SS and the Reichsbahn survived and were instrumental during the Nuremberg trials in demonstrating the organizational dimension of the extermination. However, the destruction was not solely documentary. Demolition was also undertaken of buildings, auxiliary facilities, warehouses, and camp hospitals, especially those that had served as centers for medical experimentation or eugenics. At Ravensbrück, Dachau, and Auschwitz, several barracks where doctors such as Josef Mengele and Karl Klauberg had conducted their inhumane experiments were blown up or set on fire. In these places, the victims had been subjected to torture disguised as science, forced sterilizations, amputations, gas tests, and hypothermia experiments. The removal of these structures was intended to make a judicial reconstruction of the events impossible. Also targeted for destruction were records of Action T4, the Nazi euthanasia program that preceded the Holocaust and served as a laboratory for mass murder techniques. Thousands of documents relating to the murders of people with physical or mental disabilities were eliminated in 1945. Many of the perpetrators, however, survived the war and reintegrated into post-war German society, taking advantage of the documentary vacuum to evade justice. The elimination of evidence was so meticulous that it even extended to the mobile crematoria and gassing units used in the occupied territories of the East, such as Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. These units, which operated airtight vans into which carbon monoxide was pumped to murder prisoners, were mobile in nature. However, at the end of the war, many were dismantled, their components buried or melted down. The photographs, reports, and user manuals almost completely disappeared. The cover-up also included the perpetrators themselves. Many perpetrators were promoted to disappear or to have their identities transformed. High-ranking SS officials received false documentation, were transferred under new names, and were provided refuge in monasteries, rural areas, or even escape routes to Latin America and the Middle East, with the collaboration of networks such as Odessa and the so-called Catholic rat lines. The elimination of material evidence went hand in hand with the erasure of individuals to avoid compromising testimony or future denunciations. However, despite this massive cleanup operation, the effort was not complete. The vastness of the genocidal apparatus made it impossible to erase absolutely all traces. In forgotten basements, collapsed bunkers, or abandoned buildings, archives, records, and photographs survived. Account books, transport lists, lethal injection records, and official correspondence were found at Auschwitz. Human remains and fragments of the facilities were discovered at Chelmno. And in many Eastern European villages, locals remembered the names of the deportees, the night trains, the smell of burning flesh, the ominous silence of the fields. Furthermore, thousands of survivors, former prisoners, partisans, and resistance fighters carried the memory of the crimes with them. Their testimonies, collected in the following years, made it possible to reconstruct some of what the destroyed documents attempted to hide. At the Nuremberg trials, the evidence gathered was sufficient to convict the top Nazi leaders, even though many of the original archives no longer existed. The destruction of documentation and evidence was ultimately a silent confession of guilt. The regime that had proclaimed its moral and racial superiority, the one that boasted of its order and efficiency, resorted in its final days to fire and rubble, attempting to cover up the greatest crime in modern history with ashes. But the truth did not burn with the papers. It persists in the stories, in the bones, in the ruins, and in the conscience of the people. And although the documents went up in smoke, history was written in an ink that neither war nor oblivion could erase. Without witnesses, the brutal executions of surviving prisoners, political prisoners, and forced laborers. In the final stages of the Third Reich, when the war was already decisively lost for Germany and front after front collapsed, the crimes of Nazism did not cease. On the contrary, in a final act of brutality and desperation, the regime intensified its violence against those still under its rule. It was then that a systematic wave of executions of surviving prisoners, political opponents, prisoners of war, and forced laborers began as part of a final attempt to erase witnesses, suppress rebellions, and prevent the crimes from being revealed. In the concentration camps, many of the prisoners who had endured years of confinement were summarily murdered in the weeks and days before the arrival of the Allies. The motive was as clear as it was atrocious: to prevent them from bearing witness to what they had experienced. Operation 1005, originally tasked with destroying the physical traces of the Holocaust, also resulted in a human annihilation, in which people were eliminated to erase the living memories of the horror. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, for example, records show that in the first days of January 1945, hundreds of prisoners who were sick, incapacitated, or deemed non-transferable were executed en masse. Some were killed with lethal injections of phenol directly into the heart. Others were shot in isolated courtyards within the complex. A similar fate awaited those interned at Gross-Rosen, Buchenwald, Stutthof, Ravensbrück, Neuengamme, and Dachau, where SS commandos made the decision to kill rather than liberate. In many cases, these were improvised, urgent killings carried out at the pace of the Allied advance. The SS and the Gestapo ordered their subordinates to quickly clean the barracks, especially those housing inconvenient witnesses, political prisoners, resistance fighters, members of the clergy, doctors, intellectuals, or even German officials who had fallen into disgrace for dissenting from the regime. The logic of these murders was not logistical, but political and symbolic. The voice of a surviving witness could be as dangerous as an enemy army. Outside the camps, the picture was no different. In armaments factories, mines, chemical plants, railway tunnels, and other facilities where slave labor had been used, German foremen and officers were also ordered to exterminate the forced laborers before evacuating the area. Tens of thousands of people, especially those from the east, such as Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, Hungarians, and Soviets, were shot alongside the facilities they helped build. The aim was to prevent them from reporting on the abuses, inhumane conditions, and enslavement methods employed by the Nazi war industry. In some cases, cruel and deceitful tricks were used. Prisoners were promised release if they cooperated in the destruction of archives or facilities. Once their work was completed, they were taken to backyards, forests, or pre-dug pits where they were executed. This pattern was repeated in numerous places, such as Mittelbau, Dora, where V-2 rockets were manufactured, or in Mauthausen, where quarries were exploited by flogging and starvation, and in Sachsenhausen, the site of pseudo-scientific experiments. In the occupied East, ASS mobile units were ordered to eliminate survivors from the ghettos that had not yet been liquidated. In Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and southern Poland, small groups of Jews hiding in forests, sewers, or cellars were tracked down and shot until the final days of the war. In some villages, the last survivors were burned alive in their shelters as an act of retaliation or simple sadism. Among the victims were also the Sonderkommandos themselves, those prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers, transport corpses, and burn bodies. Because of their direct knowledge of the workings of extermination, the Nazis knew that their testimony would be devastating. Therefore, in camps like Auschwitz and Sobibor, the Sonderkommandos were periodically killed and replaced by new prisoners in a cycle of silence and replacement. The latter groups, aware of their fate, staged desperate rebellions, as happened in October 1944 at Auschwitz when they destroyed one of the crematoria before being killed. At the same time, Soviet prisoners of war and German political opponents were also executed. In camps such as Kolditz, Bergen, Belsen, and Flossenburg, extrajudicial executions of Red Army officers, German communists, members of the French and Czech resistance, and even deserters from the German army itself took place. Many of them were hanged, shot, or even bludgeoned to death. As the Allies drew closer, some massacres took on a massive and desperate character. One of the most emblematic episodes was the Gardlegen massacre in April 1945. There, the SS and members of the Volkssturm, German civilian militia, rounded up more than 1,000 prisoners, mostly forced laborers, and locked them in a barn, which was then set on fire. Only a few survived the fire or the shots fired by those guarding the exits. Another brutal case occurred at Sandbostel, where prisoners were forced to dig their own graves before being executed. The British soldiers who liberated the camp days later described scenes of absolute horror, with still warm corpses and tools abandoned next to the pits. These executions no longer responded to the logic of industrial extermination, as had been the case in previous years. They were chaotic, frenzied murders, the product of the collapse of the regime and accumulated hatred. In many cases, they were carried out by officers who knew the war was lost, but clung to Nazi ideology as the sole justification for their actions. In others, the killers acted with bureaucratic coldness, carrying out orders without question, with the same obedience they had demonstrated since 1933. However, the crimes did not go unnoticed. In many of these scenes, the Allied armies found freshly dug graves, unburied bodies, smoking clothing, fresh blood on the walls, and scattered execution tools. These findings became key documentary evidence during the judicial proceedings that followed the war. The final murder of the prisoners was not just a crime against persons, but a deliberate attempt to murder memory, to bury the truth with the bodies, to prevent the executioners from being unmasked. It was not just a massacre. It was the culmination of a policy of annihilation that brooked no witnesses or redemption. Last-ditch efforts, the sinister organization and execution of death marches. Among the most devastating and least understood episodes of the end of the Nazi regime were the so-called death marches, forced, inhumane, and often lethal evacuations in which tens of thousands of concentration and extermination camp prisoners were forced to walk for days or weeks into the interior of the Reich, away from the advancing Allied armies. These marches, which began to intensify in late 1944 and reached their most tragic point in the first months of 1945, were a reflection of a regime that preferred death to allowing its victims to be liberated. The death marches were organized with a single objective: to prevent prisoners from falling into Allied hands and exposing the crimes of the Nazi concentration camp system. Although the pretexts spoke of necessary transfers or evacuations for safety reasons, in practice they were mobile extermination camps where hunger, cold, disease, and bullets killed thousands of people every day. The SS, in coordination with the central administration of the camps, was primarily responsible for the planning and execution of these marches. Officers received direct orders from Berlin, often conveyed by Heinrich Himmler himself, demanding that the camps be evacuated quickly and that no prisoner fall alive into enemy hands. The marches were organized on an improvised basis, without sufficient food or water, without support vehicles, and in extreme weather conditions. The order was clear: advance without stopping, shoot anyone who couldn't keep up or fell from exhaustion, and keep the column moving at all costs. Those who stumbled, asked to rest, or simply gave up were summarily executed at the side of the road in full view of everyone. The bodies were abandoned or barely covered with earth, sometimes eaten by animals or looted by villagers. One of the most tragic cases was the evacuation of Auschwitz in January 1945, when approximately 56,000 prisoners were force-marched toward camps such as Wodzisław, Gleiwitz, and then deeper into Germany. In temperatures reaching -20 degrees Celsius, without adequate clothing or food, thousands died of hypothermia, exhaustion, or were murdered along the way. Witnesses recall roads strewn with bodies, ditches filled with frozen blood, and ghostly columns of walking skeletons wrapped in rags. Also dramatic was the case of Gross, Rosen, where more than 40,000 people were evacuated on foot in the middle of winter to Buchenwald, Dora, Mittelbau, and other camps. Many were political prisoners, Hungarian Jews, and Soviet prisoners of war. Along the way, SS officers, fearing Allied bombing, accelerated the marches to impossible speeds, resulting in the deaths of thousands from extreme fatigue. The marches were not only physical, but also symbols of power and terror. The Nazis used them as a demonstration that even in their agony they still retained control over the bodies and destinies of their victims. In many villages, residents were forced to witness the passage of the columns. In some cases, they were ordered not to give water or bread to the prisoners. Those who disobeyed were severely punished. The images of those columns advancing through the snow and mud would leave an indelible mark on the European collective memory. In some sections, the prisoners were transported in cattle trains, but it was no relief. Without ventilation, without water, and overcrowded, many died of suffocation or crushing. Others were locked up for days on end in unopened carriages, dying slowly. In the case of the Neuengamme evacuation, the prisoners were embarked on the ships Cap Arcona and Thielbeck, which were accidentally bombed by the British Air Force in an act that killed over 7,000 prisoners. The length of these marches varied depending on the route they were to follow or the simple whim of the guards leading them. Some extended for dozens of kilometers, while others were hundreds of kilometers long. Some lasted days, others more than a month. What they all shared was misery, despair, and an extremely high mortality rate. It is estimated that more than 250,000 people died during the death marches. Among them were women, children, the elderly, the sick, people already on the verge of collapse after years of confinement and torture. Often the prisoners were unaware of their fate. They were told they would be released, transferred to better camps, or that they were being temporarily evacuated. Some marched hoping to survive. Others, resigned to dying, tried to stay alive as long as possible. The very act of walking became a form of resistance, as it allowed one to endure pain, endure death, and therefore endure annihilation. Yet there were also moments of humanity amid the horror. In certain regions, peasants or villagers threw bread from their windows, hid prisoners, or secretly offered them water. Some soldiers, knowing the war was lost, let small groups escape or simply abandoned their posts. These exceptions don't erase the overall violence, but they do demonstrate that even in hell, gestures of compassion existed. The marches concluded with the gradual liberation of the camps by the Allies. Upon reaching their final destinations, many prisoners were left unguarded, thrown into filthy barracks, or imprisoned in equally inhumane conditions. In some cases, it was the Allied soldiers themselves who found them, frozen, sick, starving, and on the verge of death. The consequences of these marches were devastating. In addition to the enormous death toll, they left indelible physical and psychological scars on the survivors. Many lost limbs to frostbite, others were left blind, mute, or suffered trauma that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Historically, the death marches are one of the most harrowing testimonies of the Nazi regime's utter contempt for human life. At the Nuremberg trials, the marches were portrayed as a form of systematic extermination, comparable to gas chambers and mass graves. The testimonies of survivors, photographs taken by the Allied armies, and evidence from roadside graves became incontrovertible proof of the brutality of the Nazi system in its final throes. The death marches were the final walk of millions of people toward oblivion, orchestrated by a dying regime that still believed it could dominate its victims until their last breath. But they failed to erase the footsteps, silence the screams, or cover the traces. A blow to the perfect plan, the Allied disruptions to Operation 1005. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the Allies began to push deeper into territories occupied by the Third Reich. With every mile they advanced, the veil of Nazi barbarism was lifted, and with it, the regime's chances of completing Operation 1005 diminished dramatically. This operation, conceived as a desperate attempt to eliminate the physical traces of the genocide, was interrupted, thwarted, and ultimately dismantled by the Allied offensive in its various forms: military, strategic, and, ultimately, symbolic. In late 1943, as Operation 1005 was in full swing in Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, the Red Army launched its counter-offensive. The Soviet advance forced the SS to accelerate the exhumation and destruction of corpses, especially at sites where the most massive massacres had taken place, such as Babi Yar, Ponary, Chelmno, and Treblinka. However, the breakneck pace of the Eastern Front prevented many of these tasks from being completed. The arrival of the Soviets at key extermination areas, such as Majdanek in July 1944, marked the first major blow to Operation 1005. Unlike other camps, which were completely demolished, the Nazis did not have enough time to destroy Majdanek. The gas chambers, barracks, warehouses with the belongings of deportees and recent cremations were left intact or half dismantled. This discovery was the first of its kind, as the Soviets found physical remains, unburied corpses, and documentary evidence there that made it impossible to continue denying the genocide. The images from Majdanek, captured by Soviet cameramen and broadcast internationally, shocked the world. For the first time, irrefutable evidence was provided of the existence of extermination camps and the mass murder of Jews, prisoners of war, resistance fighters, and Roma. Nazi propaganda attempted to discredit them, but the testimony and evidence were so overwhelming that they marked a before and after. The same fate befell other facilities in the east. In Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, the destruction was more advanced. The camps had been demolished between 1943 and 1944, and trees had been planted or fake farms erected on their ruins to conceal their existence. However, the urgency with which Operation 1005 was executed left significant flaws. Human remains were still visible beneath the surface, bones emerged from the earth turned over by the rains, and mass graves were too large to disappear completely. Furthermore, the Soviets captured documents abandoned during the German retreat, incomplete reports, camp maps, transport lists, and even fragments of correspondence between Reich authorities. Although the Nazis attempted to burn or shred all written evidence, the rapid collapse on the Eastern Front prevented total destruction. These documents would be key to reconstructing the logistical and administrative framework of the Holocaust in the years that followed. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the British, Americans, and French also began liberating concentration camps and forced labor subcamps. In many cases, they arrived just hours or days after the German evacuation, making attempts to erase the evidence even more precarious. Bodies were still piled up, crematoria smoked, and the surviving prisoners were in conditions that spoke for themselves. One of the most shocking cases was Buchenwald, liberated by American troops in April 1945. Although the Nazis had attempted to destroy evidence and evacuate prisoners, the remains of corpses, crematoria, and the machinery of repression remained. American soldiers documented the horror. They filmed, photographed, and recorded every detail. Some commanders, shocked by what they saw, forced civilians in nearby towns to tour the camps, to confront the reality that many pretended not to know. Something similar happened at Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the British. The scene was so overwhelming, with thousands of unburied corpses, terminally ill patients, and an unbearable stench, that Allied officers refused to even use the camp's buildings for military accommodation. The cleanup operation was massive, and for weeks mass graves were dug while the crimes were documented. At Dachau, Mauthausen, Flossenburg, Dora, Mittelbau, and other camps within German territory, the disruption caused by Operation 1005 was even more visible. The Germans no longer had control over their own evacuation routes. Chaos reigned within the SS, and many units simply fled, leaving the camps in disarray. This break in the chain of command allowed the Allies to uncover key evidence, from administrative files to bodies preserved in cold storage or fresh graves. The disruptions were not only military but also testimonial. As survivors were freed, they began to recount what they had seen and suffered. These accounts, collected by journalists, soldiers, doctors, and later by investigators, constituted an irrefutable source of human evidence that no cover-up operation could erase. Allied commissions tasked with documenting war crimes, such as the United Nations War Crimes Commission and the U.S. Army War Crimes Branch, worked against the clock to gather reports, take statements, collect documents, and preserve the remaining structures of the camps before they were demolished by time or acts of revenge. The final collapse of the Reich revealed that, despite the sophisticated cover-up plan, Operation 1005 had failed in its fundamental purpose. The world learned what had happened. The graves could not be completely emptied, the ovens could not hide the smoke, and the voices of the survivors rose beyond the silence the murderers sought to impose. The Allied interruptions to Operation 1005 were not only logistical, but also moral and symbolic. With each liberated camp, with each rescued document, with each saved prisoner, a piece of truth was restored, and the attempt to erase the genocide was broken. What the Nazis tried to hide underground or turn into ash was recovered by history, preserved in archives, museums, and testimonies. The final punishment, the importance of Operation 1005 evidence during the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, held between November 1945 and October 1946, marked the historic moment when the international community formally confronted the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. Among the countless pieces of evidence presented, evidence related to Operation 1005 played a pivotal role in demonstrating the premeditation, organization, and scale of the genocide, as well as the Nazis' deliberate attempts to conceal it. From the first days of the hearings, Allied prosecutors presented captured documents, aerial photographs, plans of the extermination camps, and survivor testimony that spoke not only of the systematic murder but also of efforts to eliminate material traces of those crimes. Operation 1005 was exposed as the final phase of the final solution, designed to destroy any evidence that could implicate the Nazi leaders and their collaborators. One of the key aspects was the presentation of technical reports and direct orders from the highest levels of the SS and the German government. Prominent among these were the orders signed by Heinrich Himmler and other responsible officers, which clearly indicated the need to exhume graves, burn corpses, and destroy crematoria. These documents demonstrated that the operation was not improvised, but a meticulous plan involving thousands of officers, engineers, soldiers, and forced prisoners. Prosecutors also presented photographs taken by Allied aircraft and liberating troops showing the incomplete and failed results of Operation 1005, graves still visible, disturbed ground, and partially demolished structures. These images were essential to contextualize the oral accounts of survivors and confirm the veracity of their testimonies. The testimonies of the Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners forced to participate in the exhumation and cremation of corpses, carried particular weight. These harrowing accounts described not only the daily horror inside the camps, but also the extreme conditions and constant threats under which they had to carry out Operation 1005. Their value lay in offering a unique insider's perspective on the scale of the genocide and the cover-up maneuvers. Furthermore, the tribunal heard from numerous survivors of death marches and camp evacuations, who testified about the brutality with which the orders to destroy evidence and eliminate prisoners were carried out. Their statements confirmed that Operation 1005 sought not only to erase physical traces, but also to liquidate living witnesses to the horror. The defendants, including figures such as Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, and other high-ranking SS officers, attempted to minimize or deny their direct involvement in these operations. However, the overwhelming amount of evidence, testimony, and documents belied any attempt at defense. In several cases, the defendants admitted their involvement, describing in detail the stages of the operation and their responsibilities. The impact of the presentation of Operation 1005 at the trials was twofold. On the one hand, it demonstrated the systematic nature and criminal awareness of the Nazi regime in planning and executing the genocide. On the other, it demonstrated the willingness to cover up and destroy evidence, a clear demonstration of guilt and an attempt to evade justice. These trials also set a historic precedent in international law. The destruction of evidence of war crimes and genocide was considered a criminal act in itself, and those responsible for such actions could be prosecuted and convicted. Operation 1005, consequently, was not only a failed effort to conceal the truth, but also key evidence in the conviction of its perpetrators. Following the trials, much of the evidence recovered during Operation 1005 and its interruptions was preserved in archives, museums, and memorial centers dedicated to keeping the history of the Holocaust alive. The documentation also allowed later generations to understand the magnitude of the crime and the importance of historical memory.